She came in out of the cold on a November evening with the last of the daylight behind her, and nothing in her hands but a carpet bag that had seen better years. And when the blacksmith looked up from the anvil, the first thing he noticed was that she did not look like a woman asking a favor. She looked like a woman who had already run out of other options and had simply arrived at the end of the list. The forge was going full, heat rolling off the fire brick in waves that pushed the cold back about 8 feet in every direction, and she stopped just inside that boundary, right at the edge of the warmth, as if she was not yet certain she was allowed to come farther in. Dorsey set his tongs down on the edge of the anvil without urgency and turned toward her. He was a large man, broad across the chest and shoulders from 20 years at the hammer, hands the size of a working man's tools themselves, and his face had the quality of a piece of iron that had been worked down until it was as close to its essential nature as it was going to get. Not unfriendly, not particularly welcoming, simply present. "Forge is open," he said. She nodded at that as if he had said something that required considering. "I saw the light," she told him. "The sign out front says Dorsey, Hollis, Blacksmith and Farrier, established 1859. Sign's correct," he said. "I wondered," she said carefully, "whether there might be work here, any kind. I know how to mend harness leather, and I'm not afraid of heavy cleaning." He studied her for a moment. Plain dress, good posture, the kind of composure a woman builds out of necessity rather than confidence. "You from around here?" "Not originally," she said. "I came from Memphis before the war." That explained something in her face. Memphis before the war, and now a November night in Carford, Missouri with a carpetbag. He did not ask more. Men who worked iron learned early that you did not require a full account of how a piece came to be bent before you decided whether it was worth straightening. "There's a chair near the bellows," he said. "Warm yourself." "I'll be done in an hour." He turned back to the anvil. She sat in the chair near the bellows, with her bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and she did not speak again, which he appreciated more than he would have thought. The hammer rang against iron. Sparks dropped onto the dirt floor and spent themselves. The forge breathed. Outside, the November wind moved along the eaves of the shop, and the darkness settled in around the town of Carford, the way darkness settled in everywhere in 1866, which was to say with a weight that felt particular to the year. When he had finished the hinge, he was working and set it in the cooling trough, and the hiss of it filled the shop. He took the rag from his belt and cleaned his hands and turned back toward her. "Enid," she said before he could ask. "Enid Crail. It was Marsh before I was married. Before the war, your husband," he said. "Chancellorsville," she said the second day. "May of '63, he nodded. He knew men who hadn't come back from Chancellorsville. He also knew the arithmetic of it. She had been waiting 3 years. 3 years is a long time to keep a household together on a soldier's back pay that dried up before the ink on the surrender was cold, and he could see all 3 of those years in the way she held herself in the chair, not broken, not soft, just very thoroughly tired. "The books," he said. "What do you mean by that?" "Ledgers," she said. "Accounts receivable, accounts payable, monthly tallies. My father kept a dry goods store, and I kept his books from the time I was 14 until I was married. I'm accurate, and I'm fast. The cooking. I can work with what's available. I don't make promises about what I don't have." He looked at her for another moment. Then he went to the side room where he kept his coat and the few things that constituted his domestic arrangements, and he brought back a tin plate with cold cornbread and a piece of salt pork from the morning. and he set it on the workbench beside her without ceremony. "Eat something," he said. "Then we'll talk about the arrangement." The arrangement that Dorsey Hollis proposed was simple in the way that only a man living alone could make it simple, which is to say, it was missing several things a woman might have thought to include, but it was honest and it was clear. She could have the back room, which had a good stove and a real door, with a latch. In exchange, she would keep his ledgers, prepare his meals at the hours he specified, and take on such mending and cleaning as was reasonable. He would pay her $2 a month in addition to the room and board, which was not generous but was not nothing, and they would conduct themselves as the professional arrangement it was, with no misunderstandings on either side. Enid said that sounded fair, and asked to see the ledgers in the morning. The ledgers, it turned out, were in a condition that would have given a bookkeeper a fever. 3 years of receipts jammed into a biscuit tin without order, invoices paid and unpaid, mixed together without distinction. The last actual ledger entry dated the winter of 1863. She sat down at the work table with all of it spread out in front of her and said nothing for a long time, working her way through the papers with the focused calm of a woman who had made her peace with the scope of a job before she started it. Dorsey watched her from the doorway for a moment. "That bad," he said. "It's thorough," she said, "in the way that a river is thorough when it floods." She picked up a receipt. "You paid Hendricks at the mill twice for the same load of charcoal." "I know. He didn't tell you." "No." She set the receipt in a pile. "I'll sort it out. I'll need a new ledger book. 2, probably. Hagen's, at the dry goods, carries them. I'll go this afternoon." She was back in 2 hours with the ledger books and a piece of oilcloth to cover the work table and a small jar of India ink she had bought with her own coin, which she did not mention and he did not ask about. The first week she kept largely to the back room, and the kitchen area he had partitioned for her use, and she moved through the shop quickly and without lingering, getting out of his way with the efficiency of someone who understood that the space was his. He found, to his mild surprise, that her presence did not bother him the way he had expected it might. He had lived alone for a long time. A man lives alone long enough and he forgets what it is like to have another person in his space, forgets both the irritations and the small, unremarkable comforts. The sound of another person in the kitchen in the early morning, the smell of something cooking when he came in from the yard. These were things he had stopped registering as absent. They came back to him quietly, the way things do when you have stopped looking for them. He did not say anything. She cooked plainly, and well beans, and salt meat. Biscuits that came out right. A soup, one Thursday, from dried peas and a ham hock that smelled up the whole shop in a way that made the 2 men who came in for horseshoeing that afternoon look slightly confused by their own reaction to a blacksmith shop. One of them asked if he was doing any cooking. He said no. She had the first month's ledger balanced by the end of the second week and brought it to him at the forge on a Wednesday afternoon. The new book open on the page. He wiped his hands and looked at it. The columns were clean. The numbers were right. He could see that even without working through all of them. There was a note at the bottom of the first page indicating the Hendricks overcharge with a suggested letter of request for credit against the next load. He turned the page, looked at the second month, turned again. "How many outstanding accounts?" he said. 11, she said. 7 of those I think you'll recover without difficulty. The other 4 I've noted separately with my assessment of likelihood. He looked at the 4. He had not thought about it consciously, but somewhere he knew those 4 were probably gone, and she had arrived at the same conclusion from the outside, from the records alone. "Good work," he said. He noticed she did not linger waiting for more. The town of Carford had a population of 340 souls, which was large enough to sustain a general store, a grist mill, 2 churches, a hotel of modest ambitions, a doctor who was sometimes there and sometimes not, and an opinion about everyone who lived in it. The opinion about Enid and Dorsey Hollis began forming approximately 3 days after she arrived. It was expressed first in the general store, where Agnes Pruitt said to Martha Finn that she did not think a widow ought to be living in a blacksmith's shop, however the arrangement had been described. Martha Finn said she thought the same, and wondered who had approved it. They agreed that nobody had, which was part of the problem. Enid heard about this from Mrs. Bass Seeger at the dry goods, who told her in the manner of a woman delivering a warning she considered friendly. Enid thanked her and bought her ink and her salt and walked back to the shop. She had lived through the death of her husband and 3 years of making do on the wrong side of the war's outcome, in a town that had not been welcoming to women whose husbands had worn gray, and the particular kind of difficulty that involved a pair of women in a general store was not the worst thing she had encountered in recent memory. She set her purchases down in the kitchen and stood at the window over the yard for a while, and then she started supper. She told Dorsey none of this. Dorsey, for his part, heard about it from Theo Pratt, who ran the livery 2 buildings down and made it his business to know what was being said about whom. Theo sat on the fence post in front of the livery and told Dorsey that Agnes Pruitt was saying things that could cause a lady some difficulty if they spread any further. Dorsey listened to all of this without visible response. Then he said, "Theo, you got that bay gelding's front left shoe still giving trouble?" Theo said he did. "Bring him in tomorrow morning," Dorsey said. "I'll look at it." He went back into the shop. He thought about what Theo had said for a day. Then on Friday afternoon he walked over to the general store himself and bought a pound of coffee and a sack of flour, and while Agnes Pruitt was making his change, he said without particular inflection that he had taken on a bookkeeper to manage his accounts, that she had turned 3 years of disorder into a clean set of ledgers in 2 weeks, and that he had no complaints about the arrangement or the way it was being conducted. Agnes Pruitt said that was very nice. He picked up his purchases and left. What he did not say was that he had been thinking about Agnes Pruitt's opinion for longer than was probably necessary for a man who did not set much store by what the general store thought of his decision. He noticed that he had spent 20 minutes choosing how to word what he said in there, which was 20 minutes more than he usually spent on anything he said out loud. He set the coffee on the kitchen shelf and did not mention where it had come from. Enid noticed it there that evening and said nothing. December came in with the full seriousness of a Missouri winter, snow that got into the cracks around the shop door, and coal that made the anvil ring differently in the mornings, a higher pitch that Dorsey associated with temperatures below 15 degrees. He kept the forge going later into the evenings and earlier in the mornings, and the back room where Enid slept was warm enough that she mentioned it once, unprompted, saying it was warmer than the boarding house where she had spent the past year. That had been the first personal thing she had volunteered. He said the fire brick held heat well. She said she was glad of it. That was the whole conversation, and he thought about it intermittently for the rest of the week, which told him something he did not quite look at directly. The evenings had their own quality. He took his supper at 6, as she had established in the first week, and she ate at the same table on the opposite side, and after the first several dinners in near silence they had found something that was not exactly conversation but was adjacent to it. An observation about the weather, a question about the ledger, an account of something that had happened in the shop during the day, a particular difficulty with a piece of iron or a horse that had decided it did not want its feet attended to. She listened to these accounts with attention, and sometimes she asked a question about them that was more specific than he expected, and he found that he enjoyed explaining the work to someone who was genuinely trying to understand it. She had in return explained the principles of double-entry bookkeeping to him one evening, with a patience and clarity that had left him with a better understanding of his own finances than he had arrived at in 20 years of running the shop. He had told her so. She had said it was simply practice, that it became natural. He said he doubted that, and she had smiled at that, which was the first time he had seen her smile without reserve. He noted it without comment. Christmas in Carford was marked by a church service, a communal dinner at the hotel for those without family, and the general hush of a day that reminded everyone of what they were missing. The war had left half the town with absences of one kind or another, and Christmas was when those absences stood up and made themselves counted. Dorsey had not celebrated Christmas in any formal sense since his mother died 12 years prior. He did not decorate. He did not attend the communal dinner. He opened the shop until noon, out of habit, and then closed it, and spent the afternoon cleaning tools and thinking about nothing in particular. That year he came in at noon to find that the kitchen had been transformed in the way that only a woman with purpose and limited supplies can transform a space. There were evergreen boughs on the table from the pines back of the property. There was the smell of something with dried apple and cinnamon. There was a cloth on the table that he had not seen before, which he realized after a moment was the piece of oilcloth she had cut to fit the work table, turned wrong side up to show a solid color. He heard her in the back room, and then she came out in her good dress, the gray wool, which was better than what she wore for working, and which made the occasion of it clear without any announcement. He stood in the kitchen, looking at the table. She looked at him, looking at it. "I know you said you don't make particular note of the day," she said. "I can put it back," he said. "Don't put it back." He went and changed his shirt, which was the only thing he had to offer, by way of marking the occasion, and they sat down to dinner. She had made a proper roast of the pork she had been saving, with the dried apples and a pot of beans and the cornbread, and the table held more food than either of them required. They said grace, which he had not done in years, and he let her say it because she had prepared this, and it seemed like hers to offer. After dinner they sat with their coffee, and the shop was quiet around them, and the cold was outside, and the fire was in. And she said after a while, "My husband used to say Christmas was his favorite day because everything was allowed to stop." He did not know what to say to that, so he said, was he a man who needed things to stop? She considered this with the same thoughtfulness she brought to the ledgers. He was a man who worked very hard, she said, at being cheerful. The war? She stopped. He wrote me cheerful letters from the front, even the last one. She held her coffee cup with both hands. I found out afterward from the men in his company that the last 6 months before Chancellorsville were very bad. He never said so. He didn't want me to worry. She looked at the table. I have spent 3 years being grateful for that, and angry about it in turns. He nodded slowly. He understood that particular kind of thing. He had brothers who had come back from the fighting different, in ways they did not speak about, and he had understood that what they were protecting you from by not speaking was sometimes the thing you most needed to know to understand them. My wife, he said, and then stopped. She looked at him, not pressing, not hurrying. She died before the war, he said. Fever, 1859. The year I put the sign up. He turned his coffee cup once on the table. I was not a man who was easy to live with. Too much time in the shop. too little time saying things that needed saying. He stopped there. He was not accustomed to this. But the kitchen, with its evergreen boughs and its borrowed cloth, was a different kind of room than the shop, and something about what she had offered about her husband made the exchange feel like it had rules of its own. "I think about that," he said. "Whether there was more I could have—" He stopped again. She let the silence sit without filling it. "There wasn't," she said finally, quietly, "from what I know of you. You're not a man who holds things back out of carelessness." He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee cup. She had not said it to offer comfort. She had said it because it was what she had observed, and she was a precise person. He did not know what to do with that, exactly, so he said nothing. But he held on to it. The afternoon closed in around the shop. The fire worked. The evergreen boughs smelled of the cold pines back of the yard. Neither of them was in a hurry to move. January was hard in the way that January in Missouri is always hard, which is to say it pushed on everything until things either held or they didn't. The road out of Calford became difficult enough that several families took their horses to Dorsey early and asked him to put winter shoes on before the ice made the road worse. He was busy from before light until after dark for the better part of 3 weeks, and the shop rang from morning until supper without pause. Enid kept the books and kept the kitchen and managed the household with a quiet competence that had by now ceased to surprise him. She had a head for logistics that most men in business did not have, and several did not deserve, and she had begun, without being asked, to draft his replies to the outstanding accounts in a voice that was firm but not hostile, and that had, he suspected, more success than his own letters would have had. He had told her she was welcome to sign those letters herself. She said she would sign them from the shop, noting the business address, and leave his name out of it, unless he preferred otherwise. He said that sounded right. She began handling the shop correspondence in its entirety. He did not think about what this meant in any particular way. He simply noted that the pile of unanswered letters that had been accumulating on the corner of the work table for 2 years had disappeared, and that accounts which had been silent since 1864 were beginning to correspond again. In the middle of January, there was a week of weather bad enough that no one came to the shop, and the town of Calford went quiet under its snow, and they were effectively together in the shop from early morning until sleep without any break in it, and he discovered that he was not looking for a break. She was a still person to be with. She did not fill silence, because she felt it required filling. She moved through the shop and the kitchen and the small domestic circumference of her day with an economy that was not unfriendly, only self-contained, and he recognized it because it was the same quality in himself that had made everyone who had ever tried to keep house for him eventually leave. She didn't leave. She had nowhere to go. Yes, but he was beginning to understand that was no longer the full account of it. On the 3rd day of the hard cold, she came into the shop with 2 cups of coffee in the late afternoon, while he was working on the runner fittings for a sled, and she set his cup down on the corner of the workbench, and stood for a moment watching him work in the way she sometimes did when she had a question. He looked up. "The iron," she said, "when it's at that color, the bright orange, that's when it's ready. That's the working heat," he said. "Too cool and it won't move. Too hot and it burns instead of moving. How do you know the difference? You learn the colors," he said, "and after a while you know it by the feel of the hammer on the iron. Before it looks wrong, you can feel it." She considered this. "Like the ledgers," she said. "After a while, you can feel where the error is before you find it." He had not thought of it in those terms, but he said, "Yes, something like that." She picked up her own cup. My husband was a farrier before the war, she said. Not a blacksmith, just the shoeing. He talked about horses the way you talk about the iron, the way they communicate through the sole of the hoof, the weight they put on which foot. She looked at the forge. I think he would have liked this work. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You want to try the hammer?" She looked at him. "I'm not going to learn blacksmithing," she said. "I know," he said. "But you've been watching it for 2 months." She set her cup down. He put a short piece of worked stock in the coals, and watched the color come up, and when it was right, he took it out with the tongs, and held it on the corner of the anvil, and handed her the lighter hammer, the 2-pounder. She struck twice, uncertain, and then found something in the third stroke that was more certain than the first 2, and the iron moved under it. She stepped back when he took the tongs back, and she was looking at the iron in the trough with an expression he had not seen on her before. He understood it. He remembered being 14, the first time the iron had actually moved under his hand the way it was supposed to move, and the feeling of that, not power, exactly. Something more specific than power. The feeling of a thing that was previously closed, becoming open. She picked up her coffee cup again. Her face had returned to its usual composure, but something had shifted in it at the edge. "Thank you," she said. He said it was nothing, and turned back to the sled runner, and she went back to the kitchen. And neither of them referred to it again. But that evening at supper, there was something different in the room, some quality of ease that had not been there before in quite that form. Spring came to Carford the way it comes to Missouri, arguing with winter for 6 weeks before winter finally conceded. And with the thaw came the farm work, and with the farm work came a run of business at the forge that kept Dorsey. Plowshares to be repaired and pointed, cultivator teeth, wheel rims, the endless patient work of keeping a farming community's iron in order. Enid had by this time become a familiar and unremarkable presence in the shop's public-facing life. Farmers who came in for work found her at the work table with the ledger and the correspondence, and she greeted them by name because she had learned everyone's name, and she knew everyone's account balance because she had put it there herself, and there was something reassuring about this that most of them felt before they could have said why. A woman had run this desk. The shop ran differently, not dramatically differently. But the difference was there in the ordered stack of receipts and the answered letters and the account in the ledger that balanced every Friday, and farmers who had been coming to Dorsey Hollis. The Pruitt women had stopped saying what they were saying at the general store. Agnes Pruitt had come in for a ferry estimate in February, and had been received by Enid with precise professional courtesy, quoted a price from the schedule, and handed a written receipt, and whatever Agnes Pruitt had expected. Carford in spring had the busy self-absorption of a farming town with work to do, and the arrangement at the forge ceased to be the thing people discussed in favor of more immediate concern. In the shop, the arrangement continued, with an honesty that both of them had come to rely on, which was its own kind of change. You come to rely on honesty when you have been without it long enough. Enid had been honest with Dorsey about the books and about what she observed, and about her own circumstances, and he had been honest with her in return, and neither of them had to manage impressions or protect themselves. It was nothing. On a Tuesday in April, Dorsey came in from the yard at midday to find Enid standing at the kitchen window with her hands on the sill and the expression on her face that he had learned. He poured his water and sat at the table and waited. She said after a while, "I've had a letter from my husband's sister in St. Louis. She's asking if I would come and stay with her family. She says there's work there." Clerical work, A merchant's firm. He looked at his hands on the table. "Is that something you want?" he said. She turned from the window. She looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. "I don't know," she said. "I had not?" She stopped. "When I came here, I told myself it was temporary. That's what I believed. And now—" she was quiet for a moment. "Now I'm less certain what temporary means," she said. He was quiet, too, for long enough that she looked at him the way she looked when she was taking a measurement. "I don't want you to go," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without ornament, looking at the table rather than at her. It was not the most graceful thing anyone had ever said to a woman, but it was entirely honest, and she understood the weight of it from a man who did not say unnecessary things. She looked at him for a while. "Dorsey," she said, "if I stay, it cannot be as a bookkeeper." He looked up at that. "I know," he said. "I know that." He was quiet again, gathering himself toward what he needed to say, which was not the way he usually approached things, but which seemed appropriate here. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I know that as well. I've been told it plainly by people who cared for me, and I've spent enough years without that to have some understanding of the cost of it." He turned his cup on the table. "What I can tell you with certainty is that I have not." He stopped. He looked at her directly, which he did not always do. "I have not felt at ease in my own house in longer than I can account for, until this winter." He paused. "You did that." She looked at him steadily. "I did not do it," she said. He accepted this. "Then we should keep doing it," he said. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and they looked at each other in the April light coming through the kitchen window over the yard. Two people who had been shaped by what the war had taken from them, and who had found in the work of this winter. She said yes. She said it quietly and without ceremony, the same way she said everything true. He let out a breath that had been held in him for longer than the question. He reached across the table, and she put her hand in his, and they sat that way in the kitchen, with the spring light on them, and the forge quiet, and the yard outside showing the first pale green of April grass. They were married in May by Reverend Alcott at the small church on the east side of Carford, which was Enid's preference because she had said she did not need a large occasion, only a real one. Dorsey wore a coat he had owned for 12 years, and which still fit. She wore the grey wool dress with a length of white ribbon at the collar that she had bought the week before, with a deliberateness that he found moving. The care of a woman who had decided to mark the occasion. There were 8 people in the pews, not counting Reverend Alcott and his wife, Theo Pratt from the livery, a few of the farmers who had been coming to the forge since before the war, Mrs. Seeger from the dry goods, who had told Enid about the Pruitt women's opinion, and had spent the winter feeling guilty about it, and redeeming herself in small ways whenever possible. Agnes Pruitt was not there. Nobody mentioned this. After the ceremony, they walked back to the shop together through the May morning, and she unlocked her own door with her own key, and they went inside to the kitchen. And he made coffee, and she made cornbread, and they ate breakfast together in their house with the window open to the May air, and the sound of the town going about its morning outside. And it was ordinary, in the way that only the best things are ordinary, deeply and without drama. The summer was busy in the way that summer in a working shop is always busy, and they found the shape of the shared days, without much discussion because they had already been living in proximity for 6 months and knew each other's habits. He was at the forge by first light. She had coffee on by the time he had finished his first hour's work and came in for it. She managed the desk and the correspondence through the morning, and did what needed doing in the house in the afternoon, and they met at supper in the evening with an account of the day that was, on both sides, honest and specific. She had a particular way of asking about the work that drew out more than he usually said, not pointed questions, but the right open ones, left where he could find them. He found himself explaining the logic of the forge's operations in more detail than he had ever needed to explain before, and in explaining them he sometimes discovered things about his own work that he had not articulated to himself. She told him once that she thought blacksmithing was a form of conversation, that the iron had a language and the smith's work was to listen to it and respond, not to impose, but to persuade. He thought about this for the better part of a week before he told her she was right. She said she had been fairly certain she was right, but that it was good to hear him say so. He had laughed at that, a real laugh, one that started without warning and ran its course, and she had looked at him with something warm in her face that she did not try to conceal. There were still hard days. The summer brought a run of heat that made the forge difficult, and 3 weeks in which the work was punishing enough that he came to supper tight and silent, and she learned to read those evenings and give him the quiet he needed without making him feel it was a withdrawal. He was learning, in return, that she had days when the absence she carried became present again without warning, days when something reminded her of what had been taken. And on those days she was her efficient, composed self, in all the ways that mattered, but there was a quality beneath it that had nothing to do with him and that he should not take personally. He did not take it personally. He made sure there was coffee, and he made sure the kitchen was warm, and he let her be exactly where she was. She noticed this. She told him one evening in July that he had no idea how rare that particular skill was in a person. He said he was not sure it was a skill so much as not making things worse. She said in her experience, those were often the same thing. In August, a man came to the shop asking for Enid. He gave his name as Marcus Crail. He was her late husband's younger brother, come from Tennessee, and he had the look of a man who had arrived with a purpose and was deciding how much of it to reveal. He was polite, which Dorsey noted, and he asked to speak with his sister-in-law privately, if that was possible. Dorsey said he would be in the yard and left them in the kitchen. He was in the yard for 45 minutes, which was long enough to repair a broken latch he had been meaning to fix for a month, and to be quite thoroughly aware of the fact that a kitchen conversation was happening without him. When he came back in, Marcus Crail was still at the kitchen table, and Enid was at the window. Not upset exactly, but wound tight in a way that he could read. By now, Marcus stood and offered his hand to Dorsey, which Dorsey shook. "I came to see if my sister-in-law needed anything," Marcus said. "We lost track of her after Franklin." He glanced at Enid. "I'm glad she found a good situation." Dorsey looked at Enid. She said, "Marcus wants me to know that Thomas's mother would like me to come to Tennessee, that the family feels I should not have been left on my own this long." He heard what was beneath that, not an offer of rescue. An assertion of a claim. Marcus said carefully that the family had discussed it, and they felt she was owed a home, and that Tennessee was where that home was. Dorsey looked at Marcus Crail with the patient attention of a man who has been working iron for 20 years and knows the difference between something that is going to move and something that is not. "My wife has a home," he said. Not loudly, not with emphasis. "She built it." There was a silence. Marcus looked at the kitchen, the ledger on the work table, the orderly shelves. The window with the late summer light coming through it onto a floor that was swept and a stove that was clean. He looked at his sister-in-law, standing at the window with the bearing of a woman who had fought for what she had and one. Whatever he had expected to find, this was not it. He looked at Dorsey. Dorsey waited. Marcus said, with a different quality in his voice, that he was glad to see she was well, that he would carry her love back to the family, that Thomas would have wanted her to be happy. Enid came away from the window. She hugged her brother-in-law, a real embrace, brief and firm, and she said she would write to Mrs. Crail, and she meant it. She walked him out to the street, and they spoke for a few minutes on the boardwalk, and then he rode south and she came back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Dorsey was at the work table. She came and put both her hands on the back of his chair and said, into the back of his head, "Thank you," he said. He seemed like a decent man. She said, "He is. He just needed to see." He turned enough to look at her. She was still holding the back of his chair with both hands, steadied by it or steadying it. It was hard to say which direction the steadiness ran. "You all right?" he said. "I will be," she said. In a little while, he nodded. She let go of the chair and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and he turned back to the work table and did his work. And they were in the same house and at a distance that felt like the right distance for the moment. That was how they managed things, by knowing mostly where the other person was. The second autumn settled into Carford with a golden quiet that was different from the previous November, when she had come in out of the cold, and stood at the edge of the forge's warmth, as if she was not certain she was allowed to come farther in. She was farther in now, thoroughly. The shop had changed in ways that were hard to itemize, but obvious to anyone who had been there before. There were curtains on the kitchen window, made from material she had found at the dry goods, and hemmed herself one evening in September. The shelves were organized with a logic that was hers, not his, and his was no logic at all, and the difference was striking. The ledger was current to the day, the correspondence was answered. On the wall beside the door to the shop she had put a small framed needlework that said simply, "Home," in plain letters, no decoration, which was so like her that he had looked at it for a full minute, when she hung it there and then gone back to work without comment. He bought her, in October, a sewing basket with a proper wooden lid from the dry goods. He set it on the kitchen shelf above the window. He did not make a ceremony of it. He put it up there one morning while she was doing the books, and said nothing about it. She came to supper that evening, and looked at the shelf, and turned around and looked at him. He said, "The other one was broken." She looked at him a moment longer. Something was working in her face. "Thank you," she said. He said, "Salt pork tonight?" She said yes, and turned back to the stove. He ate his supper, and looked at the basket on the shelf, with the evening light on the wooden lid, and there was something in that which was exactly what he had been working toward, without knowing he was working toward it. The second winter was not like the first winter. The first winter there had been a quality of caution in the house, the careful negotiation of two people finding the limits of what was allowed. The second winter had no such quality. They moved through the house and the shop with the ease of people who had established, slowly and without announcement, what this place was and who they were in it. She had taken to sitting in the shop in the evenings sometimes, working on her mending or the correspondence by the forge light, which was better than the kitchen lamp and warmer. He worked later these evenings, and they spoke when they had something to say, and did not when they didn't, and the ring of the hammer and the scratch of her pen were a kind of company that required nothing from either of them. He showed her more of the work over the winter, not systematically, but when something interesting came through the shop, he showed her the problem, and she asked good questions, and he explained. She began to recognize the grades of iron by sight, which impressed him more than she knew. She could look at a piece and tell him whether it was the Swedish or the American stock, which was the kind of knowledge that only came from sustained attention. One evening in December, she asked him how he had come to it. The blacksmithing. He said his father had been a smith, and his father before him, that it was not so much a choice as an inheritance. That he had thought, when he was young, about going west, doing something different. That he had come back to the forge in the end because there was something in the work that suited him, the directness of it, the way the iron responded to what you put into it, and did not pretend otherwise. She said she understood that about him, the directness, that it was the thing that had convinced her to stay that first night, past the arrangement, past the offer of the room. That he had said what he meant without decoration, and she had decided that a man who said what he meant was worth the risk. He thought about this. "I was not generous," he said. "That night you were honest," she said. "That is more valuable." He looked at the forge. "I am trying to be more of both," she said quietly. "I know." The spring of '67 came in with the same argument with winter that every Missouri spring has, and the town of Carford came back to its business with the purposeful energy of a place that had survived another hard season. At the forge on the edge of the main street, the shop was open from first light, and the ring of the hammer carried out into the morning air and mixed with the sounds of a town coming to life. Wagons on the road, a door opening. Somewhere down the street, the school bell at 8. Inside, the work table was occupied by a woman who knew the accounts of every farm and business within 10 miles, and who had recently been asked by the Rev. Alcott whether she would consider helping the church with its own correspondence, which had apparently been in a condition similar to what she had found in the biscuit tin when she had arrived. She had said yes, and had put the church's papers in order in 4 days, and the Reverend had said she was a gift to the community, which Dorsey had heard about from Theo Pratt, and said nothing about. They had not talked much about what had been taken from them, the husbands and wives and years and plans that the war had folded up without permission. Those things were present in the house the way the sewing basket was present on the shelf, there and acknowledged and left to hold whatever they held, without being asked to be anything else. But there was something that had grown in the space alongside them, something that was its own thing, and not a replacement for what was gone. It was the coffee on the counter in the mornings and the ledger balanced on Friday, and the explanation of the winter shoe, and the feel of the hammer on the iron. It was the Christmas dinner with the oilcloth turned wrong side up, the December evenings with the fire, and the two of them working in the same light, the way she had put her hands on the back of his chair and steadied it, or him, or the room. It had been impossible to say. It was the small framed word on the wall beside the door, that plain, unsentimental Ho-M, with its undecorated letters, which said everything it needed to say, and nothing it didn't. It was the basket on the shelf, with the late light on the lid. These were not the things either of them had been reaching for. When the war broke open what they had, they were something the war could not have predicted. The things that form in the cracks of what was broken. On a Thursday morning in April, with the pear tree in the yard, putting out its first pale flowers and the ground soft under the new season, Enid came into the shop with the ledger under her arm and a letter in her hand. "Hendrik's at the mill," she said, setting the letter on the work table, "has finally sent the credit for the double payment, 2 years late." Dorsey set his tongs down. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He said, "Told you we'd get it." She said, "You told me nothing of the sort. I told you I thought we'd recover it." You said you doubted it. He thought about this. I said I'd underestimated the likelihood. He said she looked at him. You said it was probably gone. He picked up his tongs. I was less certain than that. She shook her head, which was as close to laughing as she got when she was being precise, and she took the letter to the work table and noted the credit in the ledger in her clean, measured hand. And he turned back to the iron, and the hammer rang in the spring morning, and the forge breathed its steady breath, and outside the pear tree went on, with its pale and unhurried flowering. The town moved around them. The work went on the way good work goes on, day after day, honest and direct, making something useful out of what the heat and the hammer and the two hands and the particular nature of the material allow. Two people the war had left scarred and solitary, not any more, not in this place, not in this light, not in this life they had made from the wreckage of the old ones, quietly, without fanfare, the way iron is remade at the forge. Not by force, but by patient work, by heat and attention, and the willingness to stay at it until the thing becomes what it was always capable of being. The season was spring. The basket was on the shelf. The forge was going, and that was the story of Enid and Dorsey, who found each other on the wrong side of what they had survived, and built something the war did not anticipate and could not touch. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. And if you're new here, please like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, stories of quiet, courage, and ordinary lives that turned out to be extraordinary. Don't miss